The Hamas-run health ministry today said that the death toll in Gaza has now exceeded 10,000 and that many of the victims are civilians. My colleague Gerhard Elfers asked him how the Israeli government is justifying that.
First of all, as you mentioned, these are the numbers we're getting from the Hamas Health Ministry. Hamas, the same organization that on October 7th burned, beheaded, raped, butchered, mutilated its way through southern Israel and then lied about it to the international media. The same Hamas that when an Islamic Jihad rocket hit the Al-Ahli hospital, immediately claimed it was an Israeli airstrike that killed hundreds of people. The sun came up in the morning. It turned out it wasn't an Israeli airstrike. The hospital was still standing and the death toll was much lower. So we cast doubt on the Hamas numbers. We also note that Hamas doesn't distinguish between...
Whether it's exactly 10,000, it must be thousands.
Hamas does not distinguish between civilian casualties and military casualties. We've been clear. Our goal in this war is to go after the perpetrators of the October 7th massacre and make them pay. We expect the death toll to rise from Hamas terrorists, the people we are targeting. Now, what's the problem? Hamas has a deliberate and well-documented strategy of embedding itself in civilian areas, in tunnels under people's homes. Its main headquarters are located underneath the Shifa hospital in Gaza. That's why Israel has been taking more action than any army in history, and I'm happy for your fact-checkers to check me, in order to get civilians out of harm's way. 20,000 phone calls placed with residents of Gaza, 1.5 million leaflets, over 10 million recorded messages and SMS for 3 weeks, urging the residents of northern Gaza, get out of the way temporarily for your own safety. The army has also opened humanitarian corridors for residents to evacuate during the encirclement of Gaza. And just the other day, we had Hamas firing mortars at the Israeli soldiers, facilitating the humanitarian evacuation. So we're doing everything we can to get civilians out of harm's way. Hamas is doing everything it can to keep them there. And we hold Hamas fully accountable for any harm to civilians as a result of its decision to declare war on the 7th of October, and then its decision to try to use civilians as human shields.
Now, Anthony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, has pushed for a humanitarian ceasefire during his visit to several Middle East countries, and several major UN bodies issued a joint statement demanding a ceasefire. Will Israel agree to a ceasefire at some stage, and when will that be?
We will not consider any ceasefire, no matter how temporary, without the return of our hostages. There was a ceasefire on the 6th of October. Hamas broke it. It brutally murdered 1,400 people and then retreated back to the Gaza Strip. A ceasefire would literally let Hamas get away with murder. It would leave it free to do it again, this time with 240 hostages inside Gaza. And Hamas is threatening to do a second October 7th and a third and a fourth, as many as it takes, in order to wipe out the state of Israel and murder every man, woman, and child in this country. So we will not cease fire until we achieve our war games, our war goals of destroying Hamas so it can never again hurt our people and never again perpetrate what it did on October 7th. The biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust.
War
never again.
In a moment, but Israel has stated, you mentioned the hostages, Israel has stated many times that the release of all hostages is also one of your principal war aims. But do you think an all-out military assault is a good way to ensuring they all come home?
I wish we could send Hamas an email and politely ask them to release the hostages, but that wasn't going to happen. Our assessment is the hostages will only be brought back through pressure, through military pressure and diplomatic pressure. We saw 4 hostages released by Hamas because of international pressure on Hamas and its supporters. And we saw 1 Israeli hostage who was freed by soldiers who went in and grabbed her out. And our assessment is that only more pressure on Hamas is going to advance the goal of bringing our hostages home. Hostages who I should mention include over 30 children under the age of 18. There's a baby who was 9 months old at the beginning of this war and is now 10 months old. There are children who are literally orphaned because Hamas murdered their parents in front of them and took them hostage inside Gaza Strip. So we're doing everything we can to bring them home. And we expect the whole world to put all possible pressure on Hamas and its supporters to release our hostages immediately and unconditionally.
You mentioned the whole world there. Are you worried because you do not agree to any kind of ceasefire, that you will lose international support?
We know that we're fighting the most moral fight there is, to dismantle the terror organization, that perpetrated the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust and is promising to do it again and again until they murder all of us. We know that we're the good guys, and we know that history is on our side. And we know that good nations have lined up behind us, like Germany, whose vice chancellor from the Greens, not exactly a party known traditionally for supporting Israel, says Hamas must be destroyed. Even Senator Bernie Sanders says there can be no ceasefire with Hamas because its goal is to eliminate the state of Israel and murder everyone. So we know that people of conscience are on our side. They understand that the right of self-defense means eliminating the terror group that perpetrated this attack, and that anyone who wants to take the side of the baby-burning, beheading terrorists of October 7th, they're on the wrong side of history, and history will judge them.
I'd like to come back what you just said, eliminating Hamas. Israel is currently fighting a conventional war against insurgents, if you will, and that has failed many times in the past, in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. How convinced are you really that Israel can win this war against Hamas?
This is an asymmetric war. It's an asymmetric war between the professional army of a democratic state and a terrorist militia that has embedded itself inside civilian areas in order to maximize casualties. But we have no choice. We cannot leave Hamas in power, because if we leave Hamas in power, it will attack our people again. October 7th wasn't the first date in history. History didn't start then. It's been 2 decades that Hamas has been terrorizing the people of Israel, firing tens of thousands of rockets against us, launching raids inside Israel, abducting people. And October 7th was the straw that broke the back of a very strong camel. We cannot leave Hamas in place, and I think the world understands. And Secretary Blinken said this as well from his own conversations with Arab governments in the region, that a terror organization that perpetrates a massacre like that cannot be allowed to remain in power a moment longer. We will not go back to 6 a.m. on October 7th. That will not happen.
Israel's army says Gaza is now split in two. What's the goal here?
The goal is to totally eliminate the entirety of Hamas's terrorist and military infrastructure. We're going after every commander, every terrorist, every tunnel, every rocket launcher, all of it. Now, we've completely encircled Gaza, and despite that have still allowed several humanitarian corridors for civilians to leave. For 3 weeks, we've been urging civilians in northern Gaza to get out of the way temporarily for their own safety, and most of them have. Only a small minority remain in the north. Just the other day, Hamas attacked the humanitarian corridor that Israel was facilitating. They fired mortars at our soldiers who were trying to get Palestinian civilians out of harm's way, because we're doing everything we can to keep civilians safe. Hamas is doing everything it can to keep them in harm's way. So the goal now is to close in on Hamas. We will destroy its tunnel network, we will destroy its arsenals, and it will terrorize our people no longer.
Speaking about the tunnel network, are you convinced that, for example, if the hostages are being held in this tunnel network, that you can spare them, that you can get them out alive?
I can't comment on specific operational matters, but that is a top priority in our war, to bring the hostages home and safe to their families. Those who still have families to return to, that is.
Eylon Levy.